We're talking about discretion today, as it pertains to law enforcement operations. The idea that not every job has autonomy. We don't have the ability to make all the decisions we want to make. If we work when I was in retail, I worked at a clothing store and I didn't have the choice of who I was going to sell to or how much I was going to sell or even what I was going to sell. The products were told to me. The prices were told to me. My hours were told to me. Like I just didn't have autonomy in retail. Academics, not a lot of autonomy here, not a lot of discretion. For the most part, while I do give you some choices and prompts, sometimes I'll say, answer one of the two following questions. But in general, if I give you an assignment, there's just not a lot of choice. You either do it or you don't, that's the choice. But if you're going to follow the assignment, it's essentially given to you. But police work is different. Law enforcement work is different. What are some of the choices that law enforcement officers have? Compared to the retail example I gave.
Whether to arrest or just make a citation.
Arrest or cite. And do you know a specific scenario where that would come in play, or can you spin me a yarn?
Well, if I was an officer knocking somebody over and I could smell something in their car, and I decided to give them a choice whether they hand it over to me or I got a chance to search their car, and if they hand it over to me, then I could decide to throw it out, or I could decide to give it a citation depending on how much it is.
So there's some choice, enforcement action choice. You can, in that case, we're talking about marijuana, you could arrest them for it, depending on the jurisdiction, as long as it's still illegal, the amount. You could, in some jurisdictions, they allow you to issue a citation in lieu of an actual physical booking arrest, which is still an arrest. You're giving them a court date, which is an arraignment date, saying show up for the state. Or the third option you had was just not take enforcement action at all, which would essentially fall into the realm of warning, right? I would caution about throwing it out. I think there may be some policy violations for most jurisdictions there if you throw it out, but you can always book it as evidence.
Right.
You don't have to give them you don't have to arrest them just because you're taking it. You can book it as evidence. Once you start taking narcotics and not having a disposition for it, what do we risk?
Breaking the law.
It could be breaking the law. So if they go and make a complaint about your conduct, they don't like the way that you spoke to them outside of the narcotics. Officer Edgerton pulled me over and she was rude. And in the course of this conversation, the one good thing was at least she didn't arrest me though. She took my marijuana, but she didn't arrest me. And they go back and they look at your log and they say, well, where's the marijuana?
Right.
Or they said you took marijuana from them. What does it look like you did?
Like you took it for your own use.
Yeah, may have stolen it. So I would caution about destroying it or throw it out, just because there are other options, more policy-wise safe options. But absolutely, those are three excellent discretion options. So why? I mean, that is the what, but the why. Why do we give police officers the again, I'll use that term, autonomy, the autonomy to make these decisions? Why don't we give them the retail choice? This is how much you're going to sell it for. This is what time you're coming to work. This is what you're going to sell. Why do we give them the flexibility?
Because every situation is going to be different. And you don't want them to walk into a situation already on the bad side of it because, they expect it to be like the last.
So you don't want them pre-judging their decisions or pre-making decisions? I would pose this to you. We need to ask ourselves as law enforcement officers, or if we're supervising law enforcement officers, when we make our decisions, we make them as we compare what is just versus what is fair. Let's define that. In your scenario with the marijuana, Would justice be served? Were they breaking the law? In this jurisdiction, if they had a pound of, or in this case, not a pound, if they had a little bit of marijuana in their car,
Yeah.
is it against the law?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So would it be illegal to arrest them for that?
No.
No, no policy violation, no legal violation. They broke the law. They get what they get. That's what's just. Justice has been served if they go to jail for that. Nobody's going to question you legally or policy wise that you did the same thing that a robot would do. If we could have robot law enforcement officers that detected crime and put somebody in jail, don't have to think about it, don't have to feel about it, don't have to feel any kind of way. They broke the law, you did the crime, you do the time, right? That's what's just. So what's fair? Essentially, started to talk about it. Well, Joshua, what do you think? How does what's being just, or what is just, compare to what is fair then? I mean, we could even change the scenario too. Is it, if it was just speeding? Throw out the marijuana. Forget the marijuana. Not literally throw it out. Forget the marijuana. You pull somebody over for speeding, or one of your officers pulls somebody over for speeding. Is it justified to give them a citation? Is it legal?
Yes.
Okay. If that person that's speeding is on their way to the hospital because their wife is having a baby, is in the middle of labor, they broke the law, right? There's no policy violation, no legal issue with giving them a ticket. We're justified in giving them a ticket, right?
Mhm.
Is it fair?
Yeah.
Is it fair to give that person a ticket
Oh,
in the middle of a medical emergency while they're driving their wife to the hospital?
no.
What do you think?
I say it's justified, but not fair.
Okay. So we start to see the difference between justified and fair? That's where discretion starts to come into play. You could do it. You could write that ticket. I was gonna say nobody's gonna fault you for it, but your peers might, the public might fault you for it because we expect some autonomy. But legally, you're 100% protected. Policy-wise, you didn't break any policies, you didn't break any laws. You could write that ticket. And outside of some judgment, you're gonna be fine. Why isn't it fair? If we say it's justified, why isn't it fair?
Because she's pregnant. That it's actually an emergency, and at that point, you should be more than likely put your lights on and jump in front of them, so they have a safer trip.
So do we expect our officers, our law enforcement officers in our society to take both of those into account then?
Yes.
That's why we give them the autonomy. When it comes to my retail job, there weren't a lot of emergencies when it came to buying sports equipment. If you only did what's just, then I imagine, although you didn't break any laws or violate any policies, the public may not exactly be endeared to how the agency is conducting business because they want what's fair also. What are some other ideas of how we can figure out what's fair? We said in the middle of a medical emergency, are there other situations where officers can use discretion? I'll tell you right now, there are outside of. Does every single person get a ticket?
No,
Does every single person that doesn't get a ticket, are they on their way to the hospital to give birth?
no.
So there's got to be some other scenarios. Do you think every single officer really enjoys writing tickets?
No.
Probably not. I didn't. In Los Angeles County and Los Angeles City in the state of California, it is very, very, very expensive to receive a citation. The taxes and fees that are tacked on to the penalties of a citation, what is advertised, the $77 ticket or the $125 ticket, that turns out to be $400 or $500 after all the fees and taxes. Personally, I just didn't think that was very fair. It just isn't financially fair for everybody to receive a citation. Just can't afford it. There's a lot of folks that you shouldn't have to work for days and days and days sometimes to pay a ticket, for pay a ticket for rolling through a stop sign. So in my mind, I would rather chat with them, maybe get their mind right, and not have them lose, sometimes a week's worth of pay. To me, a week's worth of pay does not fit the crime of rolling through a stop sign. And officers are given that autonomy to do that. Do you think there's pressure to issue citations? I mean, we hear a lot of things about quotas when it comes to law enforcement's arrests and citations. What are your thoughts on that?
It's just the worst for the holidays and every time,
What is that?
because there's a bonus tacked onto it for cops.
Is there?
Supposedly, I don't know, because I actually got it.
Somebody else, what are your thoughts on quotas? Are they lawful? We'll start there. Is it legal to set quotas for law enforcement officers in arrests or citations? Can we tell them you have to write 30 tickets this month?
You can put them somewhere and say, well, we're expecting this because this is what usually comes from this area.
Right. Well, I will tell you that it is not lawful. It is illegal to set quotas for law enforcement. And I will tell you, as far as bonuses and quotas and things like that, if that exists, I've never seen it. I missed my bonus apparently for 22 years in a row. It doesn't, that wasn't, I've never been paid extra for the number of arrests or the number of citations. However, how do we judge officers? How do we know if they're doing a good job? How do we know that our officers are doing what we pay them to do? Like literally, how do we know? What measures do we have in place? If I worked retail and I sold X number of dollars in clothing or sporting equipment, then my supervisors knew I was out there on the floor doing my job. If I sold 0 for the month, they said, what do you do all day? Like literally, what are you doing all day? You have 0 sales in a month. Tell me what you're doing all day, otherwise you don't work here anymore. So in that same comparative vein, how do we know what officers are doing all day? What are your thoughts? What measures do we have?
We have your partner, you have the community that you're supposedly in at that point. And if they're not making a comment about you, they're not seeing you.
Sure. Is there anything even more readily accessible for a supervisor to pull? Do we have any statistics for officers in the same way that we have the sport or athletes have statistics? It's not that hard to figure out how many arrests somebody made in a month. They're documented, right? It's not that hard to figure out how many citations somebody issued in a month. They're turned in every night. At the end of the month, you could look at your officers that you supervise or you manage and say, the average number of citations issued this month per officer was 10. And if you have an officer who issued 0 or 1, what are your thoughts about that officer?
Yeah, there's a question mark.
It's different, right? It's outside the parameters of norm, right? I wouldn't say that officer is necessarily doing a bad job, but is it an indicator that you may want to keep an eye on that officer just to see what's up? Is that officer comparable to the retail employee who didn't sell anything that month? It could be. We don't know. It could be that they just exercise discretion and that's all they do. They could be doing 1,000 traffic stops in a month and still issuing 1 citation. Or what else could they be doing? Nothing. Yeah. And we don't pay them to do nothing, right? We want some sort of enforcement. We want some sort of, the word I would use is productivity. We want some sort of productivity from our employees. Since these are public employees, they're our employees. So discretion can cloud the ability to judge performance. So we talked about, financial implications, and we talked about medical emergencies, what's going on inside, or excuse me, outside of the black and white, things that the officers are introduced to from the stakeholders, the clients, what they're going through, their financial issues, their medical issues. Well, let's talk about what could be going on inside the black and white that could affect discretion. Officers don't necessarily need the information from somebody who's in trouble or can't afford a ticket to already make their decision. I already said one example is that I just didn't like writing tickets. That could be part of it. That's an internal decision. Had nothing to do with who I ran into. What if officers are just having a bad day? They just don't feel like stopping anybody. They're just going to use their discretion and ignore violations. And we're talking about citations, but there are still discretionary options available for misdemeanors. Jurisdictions a lot of times will take away discretion when it comes to felonies. If you see a felony, you have to take action. Why is that? Why do you have more discretion on misdemeanors and misfractions than you do at felonies? Yeah, exactly. We just don't want people ignoring robbers and felony domestic violence and things like that. Speaking of domestic violence, that is one of the categories that many jurisdictions will take away the discretion for, even though it is often a misdemeanor. There are a lot of misdemeanor domestic violence crimes, some sort of domestic violence battery where there's not visible injury, things like that. We have mandatory arrest policies in place that will take away discretion that is normally there. But let's talk about deterrence, something I know you've heard of before. So give me a quick rundown of your understanding of deterrence. It's one of the theories of punishment.
It's pretty much preventing other people from doing it.
Preventing other people from doing it. There you go. I'll take that as a colloquial definition. Exactly. Something has prevented them from doing it. In this case, who is the someone that you think of? When you say preventing someone from doing something, what kind of someone are you talking about?
It used to be a time where people would get together and it would be just domestic violence issues between families. Until I think it was like a brother had stabbed another brother somewhere out here, and then they had kind of like cracked down on it.
So when I say who, you're talking about offenders, right? Criminals. We're trying to dissuade criminals from breaking the law. That's usually what we think of about deterrence, right? I want to twist your mind a little bit in this discussion, because recent research has shown that deterrence is not solely applied to offenders. Deterrence can be applied to law enforcement officers. Law enforcement officers can be deterred from enforcing the law. Let's back up. How do we deter offenders from breaking the law? What do we do to them? We give them negative consequences, right? Punishment is a theory of deterrence is a theory of punishment. We give them punishment in the hopes that we will deter them from breaking the law. Recent research has shown that with enough negative consequences, we can deter law enforcement officers from enforcing the law. Does that sound surprising to anybody? I submit to you that we can deter any behavior, good or bad, with enough negative consequences. What kind of negative consequences? So we know what negative consequences are applied to offenders. We said it: jail, fines, rehab, mandatory, things they don't want. What would happen? What could we use to deter a law enforcement officer, or what can be used, yes, to deter a law enforcement officer from enforcing the law? What negative consequences exist to law enforcement?
We're already doing that here. I mean, with the shootings and everything, we're cracking down on them, as far as their de-escalation techniques and stuff. And some people would rather just avoid that conflict than actually do their job.
Avoid the conflict. All right. Michelle, what do you think? What are bad things that could happen to, I'll just kind of boil it down. What are some bad things that are negative consequences that could happen to law enforcement officers if they decide to enforce the law. They can cause harm to the community, like maybe they feel like they're over policing perhaps, okay? Scarlett, what do you think? I'm sorry? Oh, yeah. So, bad thing, I mean, because I just boiled it down, what are some bad things that, physically, what are some bad things that could happen to law enforcement officers if they decide to do a traffic stop? They get hurt, right? So, I mean, that's like maybe one of the more obvious and traumatic. If an officer never stops anybody or never comes in contact with the public, their chances of being harmed are probably reduced significantly, right? Yes.
And they also have it to where, some people say officers are playing stuff on them and things of that nature.
So they risk getting personnel complaints, legitimate or not. With every public contact, the officer increases the opportunity to receive a complaint from the public for misdoing, for misconduct. If I had never come in contact with the public, I probably never would have gotten any personnel complaints. I got a few. But no allegation of criminal misconduct that anyone ever said is true. I never planted evidence. I never used excessive force, but I got complaints for those. So we say they won't, or they reduce the risk of being physically harmed. They reduce the risk of bad reputation. They reduce the risk of personnel complaints. Mr. Dunn, anything else?
I feel like community backlash, and kind of like public conduct that they partake in.
I like that. The idea, more of that perception. So in the same way that we have now taken offenders and used consequences to change their behavior, this study showed that we can take law enforcement officers, pretty much the polar opposite of offenders in this study, and we can dissuade them from enforcing the law with similar but opposite negative consequences. So some of those negative consequences we talked about, that those demotivators, things that would take away the motivation of officers to enforce the law and thus increase the use of discretion, because that's what we're saying. We're saying that if officers are not enforcing the law, then they're increasing their use of discretion. Things that came up in this study, one of the first ones was the perception that criminals just weren't afraid of the law anymore. Just merely by the criminals not having that fear of reprisal or fear of consequence, demotivated the officers from even wanting to enforce the law in the first place. And that went hand in hand with the lack of consequences. But that lack of consequences was more seen by the researchers, was more seen as the officers realizing that nothing was going to happen to the criminals in the first place, even if they did enforce the law. So they decided, why bother? So one is the criminals aren't afraid. The criminals realize there aren't any consequences. So the criminals are breaking the law more often. The other one was the officers realizing that there's no consequences, and so they decide not to enforce the law. In this research, a lot of the officers described why they came on the job. They wanted, one, to help the community, that's the fourth one, but also to prevent crime. And those were two different categories that came out. One, they were demotivated because their efforts just weren't working. The more they enforced the law, crime was still increasing, so they realized, well, I'm not going to do this anymore, and they started using discretion more and more. And the other one was that feeling of, the whole reason that I came onto this job was to help the community. And if I can't do that, then why try? Trying is the first step to failure, that mentality. And then the final aspect of being demotivated was the idea that officers, while they had heard stories or heard that old wives' tale of, the person's going to be out of jail before the paperwork is done, it actually started being true with time. And the idea that once that became a literal truth instead of just a wives' tale. It made them feel less motivated and less, more of they were using a rational choice to not enforce the law anymore. Because you've heard me say, or you hear me describe rational choice as a cost-benefit analysis. This is what the officers are doing when they're deciding whether or not they're going to use discretion. They're literally doing a cost-benefit analysis. Is it worth my time to enforce the law, or is it more of a risk? Is it more of a risk of me getting hurt, of getting a negative perception from the community, or getting personnel complaints? So that's how, as officers started losing motivation, this is how those decisions were manifest. First of all, an apathy. Like the term that I used previously, why bother? Officers felt themselves no longer caring. And it wasn't a hidden feeling. It wasn't that they didn't realize they were feeling it. It was 100% a tangible emotion that they were able to describe. And it also came back to that same manifest of what was spoken of earlier. They realized that there were no consequences. Not only were the offenders realizing that there were no consequences, but the officers were also realizing it too. And so a marriage of those two ideas was very dangerous in productivity. Once offenders started realizing that there was no consequence for their actions, and officers started realizing there was no consequence for the offender's actions, then who's left? Everybody realizes it now. That cost-benefit analysis came up right there when they realized it just wasn't worth the effort. The idea of, if I get out of my car to enforce these laws, I might get hurt, I might get into a fight, the public may not like me, I might get a personnel complaint. God forbid, I have to get into a use of deadly force or use of force in general, and I end up on the news, I end up getting sued. Why do I want to put myself through all this when I could just, and in the term that they used in this study, I could just smile and wave. Just keep on driving. I see this crime in progress. And in these cases, this study looked into minor crimes, looked into narcotics crimes. It wasn't the robberies in progress, the homicides in progress, but they would see the officers, the participants in this study, ended up describing how they would see people smoking meth on the side of the road and just decide, in their terms, to smile and wave. Just not even bother. Because the crime becomes so rampant and the use of narcotics and the reduction in consequences become so rampant, the officers felt like the public had kind of given up on them. They took away the tools that they needed to enforce the law, and they really had some animosity towards the public, who actually is there, as we said earlier, grades their productivity. And then finally, the idea that specifically misdemeanors just weren't significant enough to enforce. Felonies are fine, but the idea that there was no benefit to anyone's career in law enforcement in their eyes, in their perception, to the enforcement of misdemeanors. They just weren't significant enough to bother with. That's why they reduced it. So what are the dangers? We're starting to touch on it just a little bit here, so that there's your hint. What are the dangers of allowing our officers in today's criminal justice system to have the autonomy, to have discretion? We said that the good stuff is that we can, if there's medical emergency or if they can't afford the ticket, those are good reasons to have discretion. But it's not all rainbows and butterflies. There's got to be a downside to discretion. What are your thoughts? Yes. Right. So as we have less consequences, then the more people will maybe feel more comfortable breaking the law. I would say that's a really good beginning of an explanation to the broken windows theory. As we use discretion to allow crimes to occur, crimes are going to breed crimes. Small crimes are going to breed larger crimes, are going to breed major crime, because discretion was allowed. Because there's a thin line between discretion and ignoring, right? These officers talked about that they ignored crime. I would submit to you at the beginning of this class, when we talked about discretion, not very many of us thought about ignoring crime. We thought about just letting somebody go and maybe giving them warning, that kind of discretion, but discretion is, it can be ugly too. What about corruption? How can discretion play a hand in corruption? In retail, I have to sell to everybody. Nobody can pay me off to not, and if I don't sell, it's pretty obvious I wasn't selling.
So when I did security, like I said, I used to work at a casino in Raleigh, and they would tell me, you can take money if the customers give you money, but just make sure like you're not taking it for like favors. So basically to say like, okay, if they decide they want a certain amount of money, they wanted to give it to me, that was fine. But then if something were to happen, like I couldn't directly be on their side of the situation because it would seem like they were paying me not to be on their side.
Right, okay. So it would be difficult to prove that somebody is buying a favor if they're allowed to give you money, for sure.
Right.
That definitely hampers an investigation. If law enforcement officers are given the autonomy to make decisions, enforcement decisions, and then somebody pays them to, hey, if you ever pull over my nephew, make sure you let him go. And then you let that nephew go. Is there any way to prove, is it more difficult to prove that you let him go because of the payoff? Because you were allowed to let him go anyway. You could easily say, I was gonna let him go anyway.
You could, but it would be a pattern of events. It wouldn't be just like one situation.
Right, so we'd have to look at patterns. So it's more difficult to realize, to investigate corruption.
But you've got that corruption, more so with the drug wars because like you said, it was people like, I could lock up, like one guy for it, but if I locked him up, somebody else was gonna come up with it, or either the people that didn't have the drugs that he supplied were gonna commit crime in my community, like, so it was a lose-lose situation at that point.
It's known as the replacement theory. Crime is going to be replaced by other crime, even if you incapacitate the original
So
offender.
then the discussion became, okay, well, do I knock this little person off to get to the big person and then put the little person back on the street, or how do I do that?
Right. So we look at law enforcement organizations in a reverse way that we do with other bureaucracies. Law enforcement organizations are an upside down bureaucracy. And that's a term that you'll see sometimes in research, an upside down bureaucracy, because you can have a chief of police or a sheriff or some sort of chief administrator, and they are the head chiefs. They are the main boss. But how much? Let's look at the Los Angeles Police Department. More than say Smithfield. The Los Angeles Police Department has 10,000 employees, 10,000 sworn employees, 14,000 employees total. One chief of police. How much daily interaction and daily impact on my life as an employee do you think the chief of police, Chief Michael Moore, had on my life on a daily basis? Not much. The head guy, well, the day-to-day influence was not that much. And the daily influence on the community. How much daily influence on the community do you think Chief Michael Moore has? Probably not much, right? Almost none. But you take a look at those 10,000 sworn employees. Of those, probably, I'm guessing around 5,000 or 6,000 are officers, which would be the lower ranking daily contact with the public. The rest are supervisors and managers. So if you look at a few thousand officers on the street that are going to have contact with the public, they're the lowest ranking of this triangle of bureaucracy. You got the chief of the police at the top, the assistant chiefs, the deputy chiefs, the commanders, the captains, the lieutenants, sergeants and officers. The officers are the lowest ranking, in theory, the least powerful employees, right? The most powerful is Chief Michael Moore. The least powerful are the officers, in theory. But if we've got a few thousand of those officers on the street making contact with the public every single day, and Michael Moore at the top, not having contact with thousands of people every single day, who really has the power in that bureaucracy? Who has the power to influence decisions and influence the community's perspective of that organization? The officers. The least powerful people in that organization have the most power to influence that perspective. And through the use of discretion, they're going to, one way or another, influence that perspective. So that is why discretion is so powerful in law enforcement. Because it gives the least powerful employees of the organization the most power to influence the perspective of that organization. Any questions on what we're talking about today?